By the 1850s, the American Railroad had tamed the vast wastelands of the United States by clearing forests and prairies, preparing them for the over 9,000 miles of track which would be laid throughout the next 20 years. Through the federal government land system, new railway companies were given millions of acres across the uninhabited West, acres that could be sold or pledged to bondholders for future development. By 1880, the nation had over 17,500 freight locomotives carrying over 23,000 tons of freight. Over 22,000 passenger locomotives were also making trips across the lines, reducing travel which had once taken weeks to mere days. The effects of the American railway on the rapid-growing industrial revolution were many, including preparing hundreds and millions of acres of good farmland for industrialization, providing lower food costs to the national market. At the same time, the Great Western Railway was being operated in Canada West, known today as the province of Ontario. The line originally connected Toronto to Hamilton, moving onward to Niagara Falls. In 1862, the lines were then connected westward towards London, Windsor, and Sarnia. It would be here that these connections would be made to the United States. This line would remain in operation until August 1882, when the line was taken over by the Grand Trunk Railway, ultimately became a major part of the Canadian National Railway's Southern Ontario route. This system stretched 852 miles, running from Niagara Falls to Toronto, connecting lines in London, Windsor, and communities in the Bruce Peninsula. For a period of time, the Great Western Railway also transported immigrants to the American Midwest through southern Ontario, generating most of its revenue transporting special immigrant cars.
To move cars across the river, they would, say on a westbound train, the train would come into Point Edward. The cars would have to be sorted in the yard, and then the switcher engines would pull them down and load. At the beginning, they could put 18 cars on the Huron or the International. They could load 18 cars, but they would have to be switched onto the ferry. And then when they were lashed down on the ferry, then they would take them across the river and reverse the operation. They would pull them off of the ferry. Then they would have to make them up into another train heading for Chicago. So it was quite time-consuming with all the work, and the yards were clogged up with cars just waiting to cross the river.
The first thing was trying just to get freight and passengers across, not necessarily looking at the car aspect. And there was a concept of a swing ferry where you'd actually use the power of the current and an anchoring point to swing goods and people back and forth. And after a few times of ships with their keels cutting the line and people ending up somewhere down around New Baltimore, they figured, this may not work as well. And so the newer concept of steam finally came across, and that development in the early 1870s, they came up with the International, and she was used to move cars back and forth as a powered ferry between what's now Point Edward and then northern Port Huron or Fort Gratiot, roughly about where your Blue Water Bridge sits today.
They used what they called break bulk ships to bring the cargoes across the river, in that they had a dock on the waterfront in Sarnia. They would bring the cars in there, the box freight cars. They would unload the cars onto a ship, transport it across, and then they would reload it onto another one, another boxcar on the American side. So it was very time-consuming. The other problem with interchanging freight was that all the Canadian railroads were built to the 5-foot 6-inch provincial gauge, while the American railroad was built to the 4-foot 8.5-inch standard gauge, so the cars would not interchange. What the Grand Trunk did in 1872, they converted all of their wide broad gauge track to standard gauge, 4-foot 8.5. So now they were able to load freight cars on this ferry and transfer them directly to a train on the American side. But it was still a slow process.
In November 1859, the Grand Trunk Railway leased the newly completed Chicago, Detroit, and Canada Grand Trunk Junction Railroad Company line between Detroit and Port Huron.
Best known in our area is the Chicago, Detroit, and Canada Grand Trunk Junction, which came into the area via Canada and worked its way down to Detroit. Best known is probably Thomas Edison's first job, or one of his first jobs, as being a news butcher on that train that went back and forth daily between Detroit and Port Huron, or what in actuality was the village, or what became the village of Fort Gratiot.
By connecting with the Michigan Central Railroad running between Detroit and Chicago, the Grand Trunk Railway had created a way to ship goods from Chicago to the eastern seaboard. In tandem with the Great Western Railroad's Windsor to Niagara Falls line, freight could move from the Michigan Central line from Chicago to Detroit and then on to Niagara Falls through Windsor. By using both the St. Clair and Detroit rivers, passing freight could be moved twice as fast into Canada. This business deal worked well. Too good for competitor Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railroad, who was owned by wealthy railroad tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt already owned the New York Central, giving him command over the line from Chicago to New York. This battle would continue for the next 3 years, until Cornelius gained the majority holdings in the Michigan Central and purchased the bankrupt line, the Canadian Southern, which ran from Buffalo to Windsor. After his death in 1877, his son William took over and quickly turned his sights on the Grand Trunk.
The Great Western lines ended at Windsor and Sarnia, but the Grand Trunk leased the Chicago, Canada, and Grand Trunk Junction line from Fort Gratiot to Detroit. And with running rights and agreements, they had the rights to run into Chicago. Unfortunately, Vanderbilt controlled all these lines, and he raised the rates so much that it became prohibitive for them to use them. There was a small line called the Chicago and Northeastern that connected Lansing and Flint, and the Grand Trunk bought that line, and by more or less boycotting Vanderbilt's lines, it cut off his traffic from a lot of small railroads that he owned. So they kind of got back at him and wound up getting their own lines built. They bought out lines that he had. They then had their own line all the way from Fort Gratiot to Chicago. That was in the mid-1870s, and when they got control of their own lines from Fort Gratiot to Chicago, they had their own railroad all the way from Portland, Maine, all the way to Chicago. They were the longest railroad in the world at that time under one ownership.
A second line would also run from Detroit to Pontiac, Durand, Owasso, Grand Rapids, and Grand Haven on Lake Michigan. The line from Detroit to Port Huron also spurred into Saginaw and to the Michigan Thumb. These series of lines all crossed into Canada via Port Huron over the St. Clair River. It was at this point that the sheer volume of rail traffic began to bring the process of rail ferries more into light. With rising amounts of rail volume, new issues of dealing with freight and customer service became a real concern for the Grand Trunk Railway.
What began to happen was, quite frankly, pure economics. You had a gigantic bottleneck that had developed along either side of the St. Clair River, and if you look at images of the time, you can see there was giant freight yards with freight cars basically stashed in. I mean, something like, in some cases, 12 and 14 tracks deep.
Had to break apart every train, put every single car on a barge, bring it across, and it got to be really hard because they were shipping animals and fresh meat and things that would perish, so they had to do it quickly, and that got to be a problem. If you've got a train that's got 50 cars on it, you have to take every one of those 50 cars.
The ferries could only move a few cars at a time, and so even to the point when they had 2 ferries going 24 hours a day, you just couldn't keep up with the backlog, and so it literally was a bottleneck in terms of economic terms of getting goods and services and people back and forth. Your growing center for particularly the meatpacking trade was the greater Chicago area, and one of their markets was the Canadian market, and getting across to Canada, particularly from the standpoint of speed. You're also looking at the very, very earliest attempts at what became modern-day refrigeration. I mean, at this point in time, we're pretty much talking ice blocks. The concept of actually being able to transport fruit, perishables, if you will, meat, and that across greater distances were happening just about the same time as this was. Manufacturers and companies like Swift, Pacific Fruit Growers Express, etc., we're beginning to see about how do we do this and what can we do to create longer lives, if you will, for some of these items. And so, clearly taking that bottleneck out of having to wait to, sometimes days to get your perishables across the St. Clair River did nothing but help that situation.
Grand Trunk President Sir Henry Whiteley Tyler had weighed his options, and while many arose, to him only one seemed logical: building a tunnel. But how to build that tunnel was the biggest challenge he had ever faced.
The Grand Trunk Railroad was controlled by interests in London, England, and Sir Henry Tyler, the president of the Grand Trunk Railway, would quite often go to England once a year, usually for the board meetings. And while he was in England, he saw a pedestrian tunnel that had been built under the Thames River in London using what they call shield tunneling. And he looked at that and thought that that was maybe a way of doing the St. Clair Tunnel.
While Tyler's idea seemed sound enough, many from the Grand Trunk were concerned about the costs and feasibility of such a project. The idea of tunneling in Michigan was not new. In fact, in 1872, the Michigan Central Railroad had attempted a similar tunnel under the Detroit River, but due to soil conditions, the tunnel began to cave in at the 450-foot mark on the Canadian side of the river. It was a fair assumption that the results would be similar in the St. Clair River.
They had tried in Detroit to dig a tunnel, but they were working in the same conditions at Detroit and Windsor as they have between Sarnia and Port Huron. It's soft blue clay. There's only a very shallow band of clay above the bedrock to work in. And again, they had the problem with brick to line the tunnel just didn't work in the soft clay because the clay is so viscous and would move, and the heading just kept collapsing. So they gave up on that. At one point, they had discussed digging a trench across the river and lowering sections of tunnel into it. The neat thing about that is that about 1909, I believe it was, they did that very thing.
Many in the Grand Trunk felt that the option was to construct a suspension bridge over the river, such as the Poughkeepsie Highland Bridge, which had been built in 1886 to accommodate the rail traffic. Some even considered the possibility of building a series of pivot bridges that could accommodate the river traffic.
The Grand Trunk of Canada at the time had people that were going back and forth on the concept of using a bridge versus a tunnel. Up till now, when they had to deal with great expanses, particularly probably best known as the ones at Niagara Falls and the Fort Erie, Ontario area, they had used large cast iron and steel structures, or early forms of steel structures, with some great success. And the question had been of, why are we not doing this in this case? And there were several feelings why, the biggest of which being, the kind of approach that you're looking at, even from a bridge standpoint, and the fact that you were dealing with a navigable waterway that, you had the mass of schooners going underneath several times a day. The height factor that was needed was looked upon as a situation where actually using a tunnel, even a brand new concept for a tunnel of that kind of length, actually economically might make more sense than trying to build a bridge in the same location.
Following months and months of debate, Henry Tyler finally convinced the Grand Trunk to move forward with a tunnel design. It would now be in his hands to develop a team of engineers and workers to make his vision materialize.
November 16th, 1879. Greetings, Mr. Hickson. It has indeed been a challenge to finally have the board understand the benefits of building this proposed tunnel. Following great research and discussions for those who are familiar with your work ethic, I am placing in your hands the great task of providing resolve to the transport of railroad freight below the St. Clair River. It is our plan to incorporate a new Grand Trunk division in Canada, which shall be under the name the St. Clair Frontier Tunnel Company. Some of the work has already begun, as I have been in correspondence with Mr. James Joy of the Michigan Central to gain a better understanding of what possibly may have gone wrong with their attempt at this feat in Detroit. I fear we may be addressing many of the same concerns. I would strongly advise for you to reach out and begin a dialogue with engineer Walter Shanley of Montreal. Mr. Shanley and his brother just completed the Hosek Tunnel in Massachusetts following long delays from its previous engineers. This tunnel is said to be over 5 miles, so perhaps through his guidance, we may just bring this project to fruition. I look forward to speaking with you further on this matter and hope to quickly develop a timeline for this project. Sir Henry Watley Tyler, Grand Trunk Railroad President.
The problem was that there's not a whole lot of room to build a tunnel. There's only roughly 40 feet of clay above the bedrock, and then you have the river above that. They tried a couple of test bores. They tried to use brick to line them, but the brick tunnel lining kept caving in on them. They were digging in blue clay, which is very soft and it moves.
Blue clay, it's heavy stuff. It's hard to handle. When it's wet, it's awful. When it's dry, it's even worse.
They, quite frankly, wondered whether or not they could put a tunnel through. If you've ever had to work with blue clay, it has properties that are unlike just about anything else. It goes from being cement at one point to being almost a fluid, or darn near close to being a fluid. And if you can imagine trying to set up something that's stationary and something that goes from a solid to a liquid and not a lot of effort with not a lot of water, it really proved to be a problem for them.
Planning the tunnel became a reality when the Grand Trunk Railway incorporated the St. Clair Tunnel Company in Canada on the 19th of April, 1884. Sir Henry Tyler placed Joseph Hobson in charge of the tunnel design and construction.
He was born in Guelph, Ontario, and I don't know that he actually had a degree in engineering. I believe he worked his way up being a land surveyor, and I think that's how he got into working for the Great Western Railway. When the Grand Trunk bought the Great Western, he became chief engineer on the Great Western Division. When Tyler decided to go ahead with the tunnel, he put Hobson in charge of the project, so he became the chief engineer on the St. Clair Tunnel. He was a very intelligent, very daring man, willing to try new things, but also a very good engineer, and he understood the problems that they were up against. So he was really the best guy that you could have put in at that time.
I think what made Hobson somewhat unique is he very much was a gentleman who believed in keeping up with what was happening in technology. Again, it was a very, very heady time in that regard. And so he was known for reading scientific documents that were coming out, what was the newest engineering projects and what have you. And so he was always looking for how he could help his employer not only save money, but also do things in a manner that could speed up processes, use less manpower, all the things that you'd hope for out of an engineer.
Once the decision was made to move forward with the tunnel, The next task was to find workers who would be willing to work in underground conditions that arose during the construction of the tunnel. Known as sandhogs, these workers would face long hours underground in life-threatening conditions.
The laborers that were used in the construction of the tunnel were, in most cases, an immigrant descent. You had a real sort of hodgepodge of individuals that came together to do this.
Well, the sandhogs were the men who literally dug the tunnel. It's a term that comes from the tunneling or mining industry. And these were mostly fresh immigrants from every country in Europe pretty well. And they had come to America just to better their lives, and they basically would take any work that came their way.
Also, it's important to note that, it's not like these guys came in without any skill. Some of them, had been workers in their countries, so they had a sense of labor, they had a sense of a work ethic.
They were hard-working people. They worked, there were 3 shifts, worked around the clock, and hard working. Like, if you were to say to anybody now, well, here, just go dig a hole for me 1 mile long or 2 miles long and 20 feet around, most people would look at you and say, you're crazy.
The whole concept of these guys, digging for 12, 14 hours a day, and then, coming up to basically go right back down after, cleaning up on a quick meal and go back and do it again, really emphasize, these were some hard individuals.
Now that the manpower was secure, the process was underway. The work began with test bores, which were completed in July 1888. Hobson decided to design a tunneling shield and began tunneling nearly 1/3 of a mile from the riverbank. He excavated great openings on both sides of the St. Clair River starting in January 1889 and began shield tunneling on the U.S. side in July and on the Canadian side in September.
Basically what they did was, on each approach, they had 2 shields, and they lowered the shield into that hole to the level of where they wanted the tunnel to start. And they built what they called a launch pad, basically, in modern tunneling terminology, which was just a large framework that these hydraulic rams could push against. The shield is basically just a big steel drum. The one that was used on the tunnel was 21 feet in diameter, and it had 24 hydraulic rams, and it had a bulkhead in it. They lined the tunnel with cast iron rings, with the thought that the cast iron was much more durable and wouldn't move like brick would. And so they put a number of rings in place, and then they would activate the hydraulic rams against the rings, and that would force the shield forward into the heading. The lead edge of the shields were pretty well cut to a knife edge on this 21-foot diameter, so that it would go into the soft clay quite easily, and they could move ahead 3 or 4 feet, and then they would retract the rams and insert another ring of the cast iron tunnel lining. In the meantime, the fellows would be at the heading, literally digging out the clay with picks and shovels, loading it into small carts hauled by mules on a little tramway. They would bring that out of the tunnel. They had 2 cranes on each side. One would pick the bucket off of the tram cart, bring it halfway up. The other one would take it from there to the top of the heading, and then they would load that, dump that onto flat cars, and they hauled it out.
The guys, and they were not just hardworking, I think they were full of ingenuity too. At one point they took a carpenter's adze and kind of give it an extra little bend so they could slice the clay off rather than dig it all by shovel. They just found it just as easy to slice it off like you would maybe a cheese or something.
We're used to large engineering projects done through big, heavy moving equipment. They didn't have that. They had basically guys with shovels and pickaxes and beasts of burden, as it were, to move things out.
once they got digging far enough and got under the river, then they built a bulkhead, a brick bulkhead with airlocks in it. They also had electric lighting in the tunnel, and while it was a very strenuous, back-breaking job, it was, relatively speaking, better than a lot of contemporary construction sites.
They had electric lights in the tunnel to work by instead of gas, because they were concerned always for methane gas, and they knew that if they had gas lights and hit a pocket of methane, everything would just blow up.
While constant fear of methane pockets were on the workers' minds, a bigger concern was developing daily in the workers' own blood. For in order to keep the air pressure inside the tunnel greater than the pressure forcing water and debris into the tunnel, compressed air was being pumped into the tunnel, being contained at the bulkheads at each end. As work progressed, workers began to complain about joint pain, dizziness, shortness of breath, and extreme fatigue. Arm and leg pain would suddenly, without a warning, strike a worker down. Nausea and vomiting became daily rituals until it was discovered that it was the air pressure on the workers that was producing the life-threatening symptoms.
Everything that went into and out of the tunnel heading had to go through the airlocks. It didn't matter if it was clay, nothing happens there, but when it was men and the mules hauling it, you had to decompress over a certain time period. And they had a couple of fellas who actually died during the tunnel digging after they had gone to the compressed air because of what we call the bends. It's the same thing that a diver gets if he surfaces too quickly. You get nitrogen bubbles form in the body, and it's a very, very painful death.
Some of these workers would come out and would have experienced what would be like a cramp-like condition, and as time went on, they basically would die from what they were labeling as a depth sickness or what have you, and what they began to understand is it was somewhat based on the pressure, and so one of the things that they developed, and it was one of the first instances in construction methods of this type, was a pressurized system for so the men could work under there for longer periods of time. They still didn't know exact time periods of how long it took for these men to be there before they were affected. And so there was a lot of, I guess sadly you'd call it experimentation, of figuring out just how long guys could be under before, or in that kind of a pressurized situation before they were able to come out.
They had horses haul the little dump carts out of the tunnel heading initially, but once they started working under compressed air, they had to go to mules because the horses couldn't stand working in the compressed air.
Sirs, we the people whose signature encircle this requisition and who represent the three gangs which dig in front of the shield on the Canada side, being your employees, do hereby request that our wages be raised to 25 cents per hour and 8 hours a day work as usual. Our reasons for asking for this advance are, first, that our work is under the ground, away from the sunlight and natural atmosphere. Second, the work is much more laborious than any ordinary labor. This and the closeness of the air around us makes our day's work a continual succession of heats. Third, it is dangerous work in many ways. The effects of these disadvantages we find to be very hard on our physical constitutions, breaking down many and making it necessary for all to lay off frequently to rest up and recuperate our health. Signed, your servants.
The men made 15 cents an hour to work slugging clay all day long and dumping it into a little cart. Heavy, heavy work. Once they started putting compressed air into the tunnel, the men asked for more money. It was just harder work because they were working under intense pressure, physical pressure, plus the hard work of it. So they asked for a raise. And they're clever people. They wrote their little paragraph of what their demands were, and then they wrote all their names around in a circle around it so that the Grand Trunk wouldn't know who started the petition. They didn't just say, I'm the first guy to sign. They just wrote it around in a circle so nobody could tell, and they were asking for 25 cents an hour.
The railway delayed their answer so long that by the time they gave an answer back to them, the tunnel shields had met. They had removed the bulkheads and they were no longer working under compressed air, so the railway cut their pay to 12.5 cents an hour. But they allowed them to work 14 hours a day to make up for it.
Listen. What the? Listen.
There were several odd things that happened to the guys that were constructing the tunnel. There's a lot of different stories that have come down, but one of the more interesting ones is they began to go under the water itself, particularly as they got towards the end. Out of nowhere, there was orchestral music that would come about, and it would be there for a little bit, and then it would go away, and seemed kind of odd, and obviously no one was taking a phonograph down there with them, so it didn't make a lot of sense until finally someone kind of put two and two together and figured out that some of the passenger boats that were going across the river had, of course, orchestras on them. And so what they were actually hearing was the orchestras on the boats in the St. Clair River passing over them, which would explain why they'd hear them and then they'd go away. But it had to be one of those funny things, and maybe even a little disconcerting, wondering where this sort of disembodied music would come from.
Music wasn't the only thing finding its way into the tunnel. While the compressed air helped hold back most of the clay, water would still seep in through the seams. In order to keep this under control, a pump system was implemented, constantly running 24/7 to keep the St. Clair River at bay. These pumps would be housed in small buildings that were located at each end of the tunnel. Following months of hard work, the American and Canadian crews finally met each other on the 30th of August, 1890.
When the two shields met face to face, they were out a quarter of an inch vertically, and they were spot on the money horizontally, which, when you consider the time and what they had to work with, was just phenomenal. I believe when the new St. Clair Tunnel was done, of course, it was only dug from the one end, but they were out about 3 inches on this end, and that's in approximately a mile, a little over 6,000 feet.
The accuracy of the tunnel was due to the first engineer, Thomas E. Hillman, and the second engineer, M.S. Blakelock, who had the responsibility of maintaining the proper line and level for the tunnel. In order to assure the accuracy of the tunnel, Hobson built an instrument station at each tunnel end. These stations were constructed of a pier 3 foot square and 12 feet high of brick. These bases would hold a pair of theodolites to guarantee no loss of accuracy due to the shifting ground. A theodolite was a precision instrument, much like a transom, fitted with a telescope sight for establishing horizontal angles. Each had a 2.5-inch object glass and was custom built for this project.
Once a day, at least, they would sight from each pedestal across, and then they would sight down into the tunnel. The brick bulkheads had a large glass window built into them that they could sight through, and they would sight down there, and then they'd do their calculations. They did all those calculations by hand, and that way they could keep the tunnel on course for where it was supposed to be. If the tunnel got off slightly, they could activate more rams on one side than the other, or top or bottom. They could literally steer the shields through the heading. So that's just incredible that they could do something that accurately 125 years ago.
As the crews were getting near to the final phases of construction, they could literally hear each other on either side. Again, you're talking, as they had learned with the disembodied music from the boats passing across, you get things floating through the clay, and so as workers began to get closer from either side, they could actually hear each other working, and so they had a sense that they were getting much closer to each other. The day came where they finally actually broke through, and of course there was much celebration. One of the workers there had a plug of chewing tobacco, and so they figured that the first honorary piece of freight that should move between the two sides would be this plug of tobacco, and so they passed it from one worker who took a chaw and passed it to the other worker who took another chaw of it.
They finished digging, but it took them the better part of a year to finish doing all the lining. They had to remove all the temporary track that the little mine carts ran on to haul the mud out. They didn't even let the contract for digging the approaches out until just briefly before the tunnel shields met, because that's how unsure they were of this project. It wasn't until the two shields actually met that they knew they had success. They had to erect all the stone tunnel portals and the retaining walls up each side. So there was almost a year's worth of work finishing the tunnel on the outside. Once the cast iron lining for the tunnel was in place and the shields were done, they removed the bulkheads from the shields. Each lining segment had a 3-inch diameter hole, and they forced concrete through that hole in the lower half of the tunnel to kind of protect the cast iron. 125 years later, they're still in good shape. September the 19th, 1891, the first official train went through, and it carried all the dignitaries, Sir Henry Tyler, the president of the Grand Trunk Railway, Hobson, the chief engineer, and numerous other politicians. The mayors of Sarnia and Port Huron were both there. They say the bill for the wine alone was $4,500, so... Friday evening, the mayor of Port Huron gave a banquet with all the railroad executives, and Henry Tyler, the president of the Grand Trunk Railway, was presented with a small sachet that had been made out of an American flag that the lady said was the first American flag to be carried through the tunnel. On the Saturday, when the official first train went through the tunnel and from Sarnia to Port Huron, all the passengers disembarked, and there were speeches given at the station in Port Huron, and Sir Henry reached into his jacket pocket and mentioned about this flag, and he waved it about, and the audience began laughing, and he looked, he had a white handkerchief. Well, he started reaching into all of his other jacket pockets, and all he could find were white handkerchiefs. Of course, by this time, the crowd's roaring with laughter, and Mr. Sargent, who was general manager of the Grand Trunk Railway, stepped forward with the sachet in his hand. He said it was such a coveted prize that they had picked his pocket during the trip through the dark tunnel.
Now that the tunnel was open, reporters from around the world came to be one of the first to ride in the new luxury rail cars featuring spacious seating, champagne, and ornately decorated ceilings with gas fixtures. Overnight, the area became so popular that for some, the town's name of Port Huron was being relabeled Tunnel City.
The important thing to remember about the tunnel itself as an engineering project is just how groundbreaking it was. That this was a worldwide phenomenon. There were entire issues of Harper's Bazaar magazine that were dedicated to just the process of the tunnel. It went around all the way around the world as an amazing feat. Port Huron, to some very real extent, Sarnia too, had a light cast upon them that they had not seen really before, or in a format that was quite this large. And so Port Huron began to get this moniker of the Tunnel City. And it spilled out into all different aspects. You had Tunnel City beer, Tunnel City stockings, etc. were made by different companies.
It seems like everybody in Sarnia and Port Huron was selling tunnel something. There were Tunnel City bicycles, Tunnel City stoves, and there was even a subdivision built in Port Huron near the station. It was called the Tunnel City subdivision. It's hard today for us to imagine, when there's so little day-to-day contact with railroads, how important the railroad was to people back then. It was your lifeline to the outside world. And so there was a lot of celebration, a lot of pride in this tunnel locally, because it was an amazing engineering feat in its day. And so I say everybody was promoting Tunnel City something. Towards the end of January 1892, only a few months after the operation of the tunnel began, that the first incident occurred, and a train separated in the tunnel, and they went back in to retrieve the cars. Conductor George Hawthorne and brakeman Joseph Whalen climbed down out of the caboose, and they were overcome with fumes and asphyxiated. So I said they were only into operation a few months when they had the first incident.
If you look at pictures of the images of the steam locomotives coming out after the construction in particular, you'll notice that usually that's followed by a large pocket of smoke coming with it. That's not to say that the engineers didn't understand in building the tunnel that was going to be an issue. They did try and come up with ideas that might alleviate that, and one of those was the concept of actually having a locomotive that was double-ended. So they actually had a camelback, is what is known in railroad parlance, locomotive with a center cab where it could easily be operated from one direction or another. And the idea in part with that is that it might be able to clear out smoke faster as well.
In the early 1890s, they were still using what they call link and pin couplers, which were literally just a large chain link with a pin that locked cars together.
Very, very dangerous device. It was said back in the day that you could always know a railroad brakeman and how long he'd been working by the number of fingers that he was missing, usually one for each decade roughly. And it was because of the fact they had to get in the car, in between each car, and drop a pin into these links.
They had a tendency to break. What would happen was that the train was coming down the approach into the tunnel, the cars would bunch up. And then as the train reached the bottom of the tunnel and started to ascend the grade out the other side, the train would run out. And if the engineer got even a little bit heavy-handed on the throttle, he could pull those links apart and the train would separate.
And of course, what that meant was having to back into the tunnel, reconnect up, and in two separate instances, it was a deadly situation. The worst being back in 1904 when a crew went in to try and get that train back out, had to back down almost into the center of the tunnel, and the engine crew and the brakeman crew was killed, including a couple of individuals who had gone in to try and save those same individuals. That really brought it home. And the final one, I think, was also driven by sort of a public outcry situation. There's got to be something better.
The same reporters that had trumpeted the tunnel just a few years earlier were now spreading the words of its dangers and the loss of life that had occurred within it. Gruesome stories filled the paper of suffocation, immortalizing the names of the deceased. Names of heroes who risked their lives to save co-workers were also included. Names such as pump house operator Alexander Forbes, who were one of those who ran into the smoke-filled tunnel attempting to save lives. Forbes, along with 9 others, would later be awarded bronze medals from the Royal Canadian Humane Association with bravery embossed upon them.
He entered the tunnel to try and help the men, and he became overcome by the fumes as well, and they found him at the mouth of the tunnel, and his hands were very badly burned. And Dr. Hayes, I believe, was the doctor that was there. He and Dr. Logie were at the entrance to the tunnel to assist with the people that were injured.
Different products and techniques were introduced by the Grand Trunk to try to keep this tragedy from ever happening again. Large exhaust fans were installed at each end of the tunnel to try to assist with clearing quickly the noxious fumes that developed from the locomotives. While these ideas helped, it was clear that the days of using coal-burning locomotives in the tunnel were numbered.
Being the home of Thomas Edison, there were several citizens, I think, that began to question the idea of why not use electricity through the tunnel. Obviously, it's a cleaner powering source, maybe not from the electrical powerhouse standpoint, but in terms of the actual locomotion being used, you don't have the great amounts of smoke, you don't have the asphyxiation hazard issues. One of the big things that came out of that then was, how do we exactly do this, and what investment is going to be needed to make that happen?
The technology was still not there to operate heavy electric locomotives. It was only a few years before that they had started using electric trolley cars for streetcars.
Concepts began to happen as far as bidding that out. Edison was one of the bidders. His concept lost out to a competitor in Westinghouse. And the big reason for that shift was Westinghouse had come in as a bidder on the power plant, but had a very good relationship with the Baldwin Locomotive Works. Baldwin was looking at, again, because they had bid and had won the contract to build the original steam locomotives, the two kind of came together and said, why are we bidding this as 2 separate jobs? Why don't we come together and bid this as one job? And the fact that they did that is really, from my understanding, why they won that bid.
The Grand Trunk specified that the electric system must be able to pull a 1,000-ton train between the 2 tunnel terminals in 15 minutes or less, maintaining a speed of at least 10 miles per hour up a 2% grade. This specification required 240 tons more pull than the original 1891 locomotives could produce. The Grand Trunk accepted Westinghouse's proposal, which would be overseen by engineer Leon J. Arnold, who would serve as the consulting engineer for the installation of the new system. The prime contractor for the installation was the Abbott Gamble Company of New York City, while the American Bridge Company handled all of the steelwork.
The main power plant generator was somewhat ironically put in a location where there had been some historic connection. The interurban trolley car barn had been located along Military Street, roughly where the Port Huron Seaway Terminal is today, and basically just down from where that location was where they looked at constructing the new power plant. It was important that the power plant had fairly easy access to coal, and in the location that they put it along the St. Clair River, it had both access from a rail car standpoint. They could actually load coal cars right into the plant, but also, if need be, they were located right next to what later became the Cleveland Cliffs Coal Company. Coal coming from water versus coming from rail, they had the ability then to take whichever one was least expensive at the time.
By 1907, they had converted everything over to electricity. They had overhead wires running through the tunnel. The tunnel company had built a generating plant which supplied electricity to not only to the tunnel for the operation of the locomotives, but it supplied lighting for both Sarnia and Port Huron yards, the station buildings, and all the rest of the railway and that. And that overcame the problem of asphyxiation. It also improved the actual operation of the tunnel. They claimed that it would take approximately 3 years to train a man to become an engineer on a locomotive, and the electric locomotives were so much simpler to operate that they said in 6 months they could have a man fully trained to operate them.
When it was all said and done, the overall conversion cost was in excess of $1 million, according to the Port Huron Weekly Times. Although the Grand Trunk had signed the electrification contract with Westinghouse in January 1906, the first electric locomotive did not pull freight through the tunnel until the 20th of February 1908.
As might be expected, when you have so much traffic flowing between two countries, even countries that for the most part have had a very good relationship, as Canada and the U.S. have, when you get into times of war, these arteries become vital to the national network. Much of the traffic flowing from the U.S. to Canada, who had been in the war since 1914, even though the U.S. was still considered neutral, much of that traffic was war munitions, was several things for what would be the European war front.
During World War I, a gentleman from Marine City by the name of Albert Karl Kaltschmidt, who was of German descent, and his wife and a couple of cohorts who were also of German descent, attempted a sabotage plan.
A flatboard placed onto roller skates that would have been fit over the rails, strapped with a large amount of TNT, and let that roll right into the tunnel with the timer and blow up. A very crude method, but what could have been a very real option.
They were all convicted and sent to prison in Leavenworth for a number of years and fined very, very substantial fines in the vicinity of $10,000 to $20,000, which was a lot of money.
The plot was found out, thankfully, very early on, and it never actually reached the sabotage stage. In World War II, however, there was a plot, or what was believed to have been a plot, that came from the Canadian side.
Guards were posted at the tunnel, and at one point a train exited the tunnel on the Canadian side, and it was a load of auto parts, and it was discovered to be on fire. Someone had drilled holes into the wooden flooring and put some oil-soaked rags in there. Sort of Molotov cocktail fashion. And it was believed that the concept was literally to have that car catch flame and or derail inside the tunnel. While nothing was actually proven, the suspicion was that it was aimed at a car of ammunition that had gone through just prior to that.
On May 8, 1945, the Allies accepted Germany's surrender and the world went back to normal living. The same could be said for the Grand Trunk and the St. Clair Tunnel. The process of switching locomotives to run freight through the tunnel continued until 1958, when the electric-powered locomotives were retired, being scrapped in 1959.
The only thing that really killed the electric locomotives was old age. They ran those from 1907 till 1958, but by that time the locomotives were getting worn out. The railroad had actually bought the patterns from Baldwin, and they were making some of their own repair parts in their shops. But the locomotives were just becoming very expensive to operate because of the maintenance. By that time, the railroads had all switched over to diesel locomotives, and the diesel locomotives give out far fewer fumes in a confined space.
The diesel locomotives were not the only change to be seen in the Grand Trunk operations. By the 1960s, railways in North America started to see the dimension of freight cars increase. High-cube box cars, automotive carriers, and certain international chemical tankers all exceeded the limits of the tunnel's dimensions.
The tunnel allowed, obviously, a much speedier flow of traffic and development of some of the rail technology that went through it. The growth of the freight cars in particular began to slowly and very slowly seal the fate of the original tunnel. Started out to be, there's a couple cars here that we might have to divert because of their heights. Growingly became a situation, particularly in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when you had the development of the high cube auto rack car, later the closed auto transport vehicles, and the fact that we're in the state of Michigan meant that that was a rather large commodity for Grand Trunk Western Canadian National.
At one point in the 50s, they had gone in and lowered the track slightly in the tunnel, but that only gave them a few inches extra on that and only delayed the process. It became obsolete in the late 60s, really. In the early 70s, CN began a ferry operation to move high-level auto rack and auto parts cars across the river. So they had really come full circle from a ferry operation and through the tunnel back to the ferry operation. But again, that was very time-consuming because loads of new automobiles would come into Sarnia or Port Huron yard, and then they would have to be taken out of the train, moved to the yard down on the waterfront, put on a ferry, moved across the river, unloaded, taken back to the yard at either Port Huron or Sarnia, and put back into another train. So it was time-consuming. By the early 80s, that CN was running what they called double-stack trains, where they put two containers on one freight car on top of another and stacked them. And again, these cars were too high to go through the old tunnel.
In 1991, a new proposal was made to construct a second tunnel. This time, a single machine called the Excalibur, produced by the Lovett Tunneling Company, would dig the tunnel, starting on the Canadian side, working its way alongside of the original tunnel.
It's a single-track tunnel, but it allowed them to run the double-stack trains through. Operations were changed considerably. They have rulings now where they don't have to change crews. A crew, say from Canada, can run right through to Flint before they do a change, and alternatively, a crew from the States can run through to London before they do the crew change. So again, it was a matter of streamlining the operation and being able to move the larger, oversized cars.
Excalibur broke through in 1994, and the new tunnel was dedicated on May 5, 1995. As for the original tunnel, its ends were sealed and the pumps were silenced, allowing her to slowly fill with water, fading into the pages of history. The St. Clair Tunnel operated for over 100 years, and because of its size and the accuracy in which it was built, it will go down in history as being one of the greatest engineering marvels of its day. In 1993, the tunnel was recognized as a Michigan Historic Landmark, making sure that its story will never fade away into the pages of the past. For a Moment in History, I'm Chris Troy, reminding you that history lives in all of us. Thanks for watching.